The ballroom of the Argent Hotel was a galaxy of manufactured stars. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of black ties and sequined gowns, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted squab. It was the apotheosis of my father's life, a grand, theatrical farewell to the empire he had built, or rather, the one my grandfather had built and he had commandeered. Arthur Vance, a man who could command a room with a raised eyebrow, was retiring. And I, Ilara Vance, his eldest child and presumed heir, felt a familiar cocktail of filial pride and a low, thrumming anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my 34 years of life. For 2 decades I had been his shadow, his apprentice, his right-hand girl, as he so charmingly and diminutively put it. I had sacrificed my own ambitions, my own identity, to become the perfect successor for Vance & Cubber's construction. I'd earned an MBA from Wharton, not because I wanted to, but because he'd offhandedly remarked that the company needed real business acumen. I'd spent my 20s on dusty construction sites, learning about tensile strength and load-bearing walls, while my friends were backpacking through Europe. I'd poured my soul into every project, every quarterly report, every negotiation. Tonight was meant to be the culmination of that sacrifice. The coronation. My husband, Liam, squeezed my hand under the starched white linen of our table. His touch was my anchor in this swirling vortex of expectation. He was a history professor at the local university, a quiet, steady man who seemed wonderfully out of place in my father's world of sharp edges and sharper deals. He saw me not as Arthur Vance's daughter, but as Ilara. He was my calm, my sanctuary. "He's about to start," Liam murmured, his gaze fixed on the podium where my father was adjusting the microphone, basking in the glow of the spotlight. The room fell into a reverent hush. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. Arthur began his speech, his voice a rich, practiced baritone that had swayed city councils and charmed ruthless investors for 40 years. He recounted the company's history, painting a heroic mural of his own leadership. He mentioned my grandfather, of course, but only as the man who laid the humble foundation upon which he, Arthur, had erected a skyscraper of success. He thanked the board, the clients, his wonderful wife, my mother, who beamed at him from our table, her adoration as blinding as the diamond necklace he'd gifted her for their anniversary. Then his eyes found mine. "And of course," he boomed, a magnanimous smile spreading across his face, "I must thank my daughter Ilara. She's been a tremendous support over the years. Her organisational skills are second to none. I don't think we've ever had a gala, a fundraiser, or a company picnic go off so smoothly. Her attention to detail is truly a gift." A smattering of polite applause followed. I felt a cold dread wash over me. A gala pleine? A picnic organiser? The words were a public pat on the head, the kind you give a child who's coloured within the lines. All my work, the billion-dollar infrastructure deals I'd structured, the cost-saving supply chain logistics I'd implemented, the land acquisitions I'd personally negotiated, all reduced to party planning. I could feel the pitying glances from my colleagues, the confused looks from my friends. Liam's hand tightened on mine, his knuckles white. I tried to breathe, telling myself this was just his clumsy patriarchal way of being sentimental. The main announcement was yet to come. "A legacy is not just about what you build," he continued, his voice swelling with performative emotion. "It's about who you leave behind to carry the torch. It requires vision, strength, and a bold new perspective." He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on my younger brother, Julian. "And that is why it is my immense pride and privilege to announce the new CEO of Vance & Co. My son, Julian Vance." The air was sucked out of my lungs. The room erupted in applause, a deafening roar that felt like a physical blow. Julian, 26 years old, with a communications degree and a work history that consisted of a 2-year stint in the company's marketing department, stood up, a look of shocked, boyish glee on his face. He hadn't known. This was my father's masterstroke, a surprise to us both. Julian hugged our father at the podium, the flashbulbs of the press photographers flickering like strobing lightning. I was frozen, a statue in a designer gown. My father hadn't just passed me over. He had publicly, deliberately, and utterly humiliated me. He had erased my 2 decades of devotion, and redefined my life's work as a hobby. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations. People avoided my eyes. They'd approach, offer a limp handshake, and mutter something about what a surprise it was, their faces a mask of awkward sympathy. I felt like a ghost at my own funeral. The drive home was a cocoon of suffocating silence. The city lights smeared past the window, each one a tiny explosion in my fractured vision. I was no longer holding back the tears. They streamed down my face, hot and silent. I had given him everything, and he had treated me like nothing. Liam drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw set so tightly I was afraid it might crack. The silence in the car was different from our usual comfortable quiet. It was heavy, charged with an energy I'd never felt from him before. It was a cold, simmering rage. Suddenly he pulled the car over, screeching to a halt on a deserted side street overlooking the city. He killed the engine. In the abrupt silence I could hear my own ragged sobs. "Ilara," he said, his voice dangerously low. He turned to face me, and the man I saw was not my gentle academic husband. His eyes, usually so warm and kind, were like chips of ice. "Listen to me. He didn't just sideline you. He didn't just humiliate you." I looked at him, confused, my grief momentarily overshadowed by the intensity in his voice. "What are you talking about, Liam? He gave my life's work to Julian on a silver platter." "It's worse than that," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's been stealing from you, from the company, from its employees. For years. He's been gutting it from the inside out, and he just handed Julian an empty gilded shell." I stared at him, my mind unable to process the words. "Stealing? Liam, that's insane. My father is... He's a pillar of the community. He's a criminal, Ilara," Liam cut in, his voice hard as steel. "And I can prove it." My head was spinning. How? How could you possibly know that? The days that followed the retirement dinner were a descent into a surreal underworld, a secret history of my own life. Our pristine, minimalist home, once a sanctuary of calm, became a war room. Liam led me into his study, a room I'd always seen as a charmingly cluttered academic den, filled with books on medieval Europe and framed historical maps. He closed the door, and with a series of clicks, a section of the bookshelf slid away, revealing not more books but a wall of monitors, servers humming quietly, and a whiteboard covered in a terrifying spiderweb of names, dates and account numbers. This was not the office of a history professor. This was the command centre of a hunter. "He's been doing this for at least 15 years, Liam began, his voice taking on the clipped, precise tone of the investigator he used to be. He pointed to a flowchart that started with Vance & Co. and branched out into a dozen smaller, unfamiliar company names. "These are shell corporations, Apex Holdings, Sterling Materials, Crestline Logistics. They exist only on paper, registered in Delaware or Nevada. Your father sets them up through a proxy, a disgraced lawyer named Marcus Thorne." The name hit me like a punch. Marcus Thorne. I remembered him. A family friend who had a falling out with my father years ago. I'd been told Thorne had developed a drinking problem and become unreliable. "He didn't have a drinking problem," Liam said, as if reading my mind. "He got greedy. He's the one who manages the paperwork for a hefty fee." Liam then walked me through the scheme, and with every word, a piece of my past was recontextualized into something ugly and fraudulent. The phantom billing was the cornerstone of the operation. Vance & Co. would contract with one of the shell corporations for, say, geotechnical surveys, or specialised material procurement for a major construction project. The Shell Corp would submit an invoice for millions of dollars. My father, as CEO, would personally approve the payment, but no surveys were ever done, no materials were ever delivered. The money would be wired from Vance & Co. into the Shell Corporation's bank account. From there, it would be sliced up and funneled through another series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Panama, until it was untraceable. Finally, it would land in a master account under a trust name, the Argent Foundation. "The Argent Foundation?" I whispered, the name of the hotel where he'd just destroyed me echoing in the room. "A final little joke for himself," Liam said grimly. "He uses it to fund his lifestyle. The private jet, the yacht, the political donations that make investigations like mine disappear." My anger was a physical thing, a hot, acidic bile rising in my throat. I thought of the countless times I'd argued with him, begged him not to lay off skilled workers during economic downturns. He'd always put on a show of regret, sighing about tough but necessary business decisions. He was firing loyal men and women, people with families and mortgages, while he was siphoning millions into his personal slush fund. The injustice of it was staggering. "How did I not see this?" I asked, my voice trembling with rage. "I was the COO. I saw the financials." "He kept you buried," Liam explained, pulling up a series of project files on one of the monitors. "Look, here's the Hudson Tower project. You managed every aspect of the build, the logistics, the labour negotiations, the safety compliance. You were brilliant." But he assigned the budget oversight to the CFO, a man named Gerald Finney, who has been his creature for 30 years. You were given the operational headache, while they handled the flow of money. He praised you for your diligence and on-the-ground expertise, because it kept you exactly where he wanted you, in the trenches, covered in dirt, while he was looting the treasury from his penthouse office. Every memory was now tainted. The time he'd protected me from an international expansion deal, telling me it was too risky for a young woman to handle. Liam showed me the truth. The deal was with a country that had strict anti-corruption laws, and he couldn't risk the scrutiny. The time he'd promoted Julian to lead the marketing campaign for our new luxury condos, a project I had conceived and developed. He'd claimed it was to broaden Julian's horizons. The real reason was that the marketing budget was one of his primary vehicles for phantom billing, and my hopelessly naive brother wouldn't know a fraudulent invoice if it was tattooed on his forehead. He had weaponized my love, my trust, and my ambition against me. He had cultivated my loyalty while using me as a shield. If anyone ever looked too closely at the company's success, they would see me, the hard-working, brilliant daughter, and assume everything was legitimate. I was his cover. The rage was so profound it left me breathless. It was a bottomless well of betrayal. I stumbled out of the hidden office and into the living room, the familiar space now feeling alien. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. I had to talk to my mother. She had to know. She had to believe me. I drove to my parents' estate the next morning. The sprawling stone mansion felt like a mausoleum. I found my mother in the sunroom, arranging flowers, humming to herself. She looked up, her smile bright and brittle. "Elara, darling, I was so worried you were upset about last night. Your father just feels Julian needs the guidance, the responsibility. It's for his own good." "Mother," I said, my voice flat. "Dad is stealing from the company. He has been for years. He's a criminal." Her smile vanished. Her face hardened into a mask of disapproval I knew all too well. "Don't be ridiculous. Your father is a great man. You're just bitter because he chose your brother. Honestly, Elara, I expected more maturity from you. This jealousy is so unbecoming. This isn't jealousy." I practically shouted, my control snapping. "This is a fact. He has stolen hundreds of millions of dollars. He's going to bankrupt the company. Liam has proof." The mention of Liam was a mistake. Her eyes narrowed. "Liam? That quiet little professor? What would he know about business? This is his doing, isn't it? He's been filling your head with these poisonous ideas because he's insecure, intimidated by your father's success." It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a tactic she had learned from the master himself. She dismissed, denied, and deflected, turning the blame back onto me, onto my husband. She painted me as the hysterical, ungrateful daughter, and my father as the benevolent patriarch forced to make a tough decision. I laid out the details, the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the systematic fraud. She just shook her head, a look of pity on her face. "You've worked yourself into a state, darling. You need to rest. Apologise to your father. I'm sure he'll forgive you for this outburst." I left her house feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The injustice was a suffocating blanket. My father was the villain, but my mother was his willing accomplice, the guardian of his lies. The days that followed my mother's dismissal were the darkest. The initial fire of my rage had cooled into a heavy, suffocating ash of despair. My father's betrayal was a fortress, reinforced by my mother's denial and my brother's ignorance. I was an army of one, laying siege to an unbreachable castle. Liam's secret office became my world. I spent hours staring at the web of deceit on his whiteboard, the names of shell corporations and offshore banks swimming before my eyes. Liam had an incredible amount of evidence, a meticulously documented history of transactions, forged signatures and laundered money. It was a towering mountain of proof, But as he explained, we were missing the peak. "We have the entire money trail," he said one evening, his brow furrowed as he traced a line on the screen with his finger. "We can prove Vance & Co. paid millions to Apex Holdings for services never rendered. We can follow that money through 3 different banks in the Caymans. But then it goes dark. It disappears into the Argent Foundation, a trust registered in Liechtenstein. The beneficial owner is hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy laws. We have enough to trigger a federal investigation that would last for years and cost a fortune, but we don't have the smoking gun. We don't have the one document that irrefutably ties Arthur Vance, the man, to the Argent Foundation." He called it the Rosetta Stone, a ledger, a signed document, a password-protected file on a hard drive, something that acted as the key to the entire criminal enterprise. "Your father is too smart to leave a digital trail back to himself," Liam continued. "He's old school. I'll bet my life the final key is on a physical device, something he keeps under lock and key, completely disconnected from any network. An air-gapped drive." The thought of my father's arrogance, his meticulous planning, sent another wave of helpless fury through me. He had thought of everything. He had built a perfect crime, and my humiliation was just the final decorative touch. Hope felt like a distant country I might never visit again. That night, I was sitting in our living room, staring blankly at a family photo on the mantelpiece. It was from a decade ago, at a company charity event, my father beaming in the centre, my mother on his arm, Julian, a gangly teenager, and me standing slightly apart, a polite smile on my face. Looking at that photo, a memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. It wasn't about my father, but about the woman standing just behind him in the picture, almost out of frame, her expression professional and serene. Margaret Shaw, my father's executive assistant for over 30 years. She had been more than a secretary. She was the company's institutional memory, the quiet, efficient engine that made everything run. And then, about 6 months ago, she was gone. My father had thrown her a small, perfunctory retirement party. He'd made a speech about her well-deserved rest after a minor health scare. But I remembered visiting Margaret a week later. She'd seemed perfectly healthy, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a guardedness I hadn't understood at the time. She'd been evasive when I asked about her retirement, changing the subject quickly. At the time, I'd dismissed it as her wanting privacy. Now I saw it in a new light. My father didn't discard loyal people without a reason. "Liam," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the house. "What do you know about Margaret Shaw?" He looked up from his laptop. "Margaret? Your father's assistant? I know she retired in March. Why?" "He forced her out," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "I'm sure of it. He said she was sick, but she wasn't. She was always so principled, so meticulous. If anyone would notice a strange invoice or a suspicious wire transfer, it would be her. What if she started asking questions?" A new energy surged through me. It was a fragile, flickering ember of hope, but it was there. I had to find her. I had to talk to her. It took me 2 days to get a meeting. I left messages on her home phone that went unreturned. Finally, I drove to her small, tidy house in the suburbs and waited. When she finally came home from the grocery store, she looked startled to see me. She was hesitant, her face a polite, unreadable mask, but I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "Margaret, please," I begged, standing on her doorstep. "I need your help. I know what he's been doing." I saw her resolve crumble. She wordlessly opened the door and let me in. Over cups of tea in her floral-patterned living room, I told her everything. I told her about the retirement dinner, about Liam's investigation, about the shell companies and the stolen money. As I spoke, I watched decades of carefully constructed composure fall away from her. When I finished, she was crying silently, her hands trembling around her teacup. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong." She told me her story. About 4 months before her retirement, she had been processing a payment to a company she'd never heard of, Sterling Materials, for an 8-figure sum. The invoice lacked the usual detailed documentation. When she questioned it, my father had been furious, his charm evaporating into a cold rage she'd never seen before. He told her to mind her own business and process the payment. But Margaret was a creature of habit and principle. She started looking back through the records, noticing more and more of these unusual payments to unknown vendors, always personally approved by my father. I started a file, she confessed, her voice barely audible. Just notes for myself. A list of the company names, the dates, the amounts. I kept it in a locked drawer in my desk. One afternoon, she returned from lunch to find my father in her office, standing by her desk. The lock on her drawer was broken. The file was gone. 2 days later, he called her into his office and told her the board had approved a generous early retirement package for her, citing their concern for her failing health. It was a threat, wrapped in a velvet glove. Accept the money and stay silent or be destroyed. She was a widow with no children and a modest pension. She felt she had no choice. He took my file, she said, her voice filled with a quiet shame. But a good assistant always keeps a backup. She stood up and went to an old roll-top desk in the corner. From a hidden compartment, she pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. I copied my notes here every night before I went home, she said, handing it to me. I don't know if it will help, but it's everything I found. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a logbook of my father's crimes, written in her elegant, precise cursive. Dates, amounts, names of shell corporations. It corroborated everything Liam had discovered. It was the human element we were missing, a witness to his greed. But there was more. On the last page, she had written a short note. He keeps a second set of books. I saw him with a small silver hard drive. He stores it in the wall safe, behind the portrait of his father. Office, east wall. A wall safe. A silver hard drive. This was it. This was the hope we needed. This was the Rosetta Stone. Margaret. I looked at her, my heart pounding with a fierce, newfound purpose. You've done more than help. You've given us a weapon. A surge of empowerment, clean and powerful, washed away the last vestiges of my The discovery of the safe and the silver hard drive transformed our mission. We were no longer just gathering historical evidence. We were planning an active intelligence operation. The objective was clear: retrieve the contents of that drive. Liam's hidden office became a hive of activity, the air buzzing with a tense, focused energy. Margaret's notebook lay open on the central desk, like a sacred text, our guide into the enemy's fortress. The first step was reconnaissance. Margaret, with her 30 years of intimate knowledge of my father's habits, was our greatest asset. We sat with her for hours while she drew a detailed layout of the east wing of my parents' estate, specifically my father's private office. The portrait is of your grandfather, Elias Vance, she explained, her pen sketching the dimensions of the room. It's a heavy oil painting hinged on the left. The safe is behind it. It's a biometric model, top of the line. It requires a 6-digit code and his thumbprint. A biometric safe. My heart sank. His thumbprint? How are we supposed to get that? We don't, Liam said, looking up from a schematic he'd pulled up on his monitor. Most high-end biometric safes have a failsafe, a physical key override for emergencies. Arthur is arrogant, but he's not stupid. He'll have a key. We just need to find out where he keeps it. Margaret's brow furrowed in thought. He was always fiddling with the bronze eagle statue on his desk, she said slowly. The one the Chamber of Commerce gave him. He was very particular about it. No one, not even the cleaning staff, was allowed to touch it. Liam and I exchanged a look. It was a long shot, but it was the only one we had. The next problem was timing. Getting into that office would be nearly impossible on a normal day. My father worked from home frequently, and the estate's security system was state-of-the-art. But then Margaret reminded us of the perfect opportunity, the annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala. It was my father's crowning social event of the year, held at the estate itself. The house would be swarming with hundreds of guests, caterers and staff. My father, the consummate host, would be completely absorbed in playing the role of the city's great benefactor. It was the perfect cover. The gala was in 10 days. We had our window. The plan began to take shape. Each of us assigned a critical role. Liam was the tech guru and strategist. He spent days buried in his work, using his old DOJ contacts to discreetly obtain the estate's security blueprints. He identified the blind spots in the camera coverage, the frequency of the patrol routes for the private security guards, and the specific model of the alarm system connected to the office. It's a magnetic sensor on the door and window frames, he explained, pointing to the blueprint. But there's a master control panel in the basement security office. If we can create a momentary power fluctuation, we can reboot the system. It will create a 2-minute window where the sensors are offline before the backup power kicks in. That's your window to get in and out of the room. He also began assembling our tech kit, a miniature camera to scope out the safe, a device to clone the hard drive in seconds, and a set of sophisticated lockpicks for the override key, just in case. Margaret was our inside source, our oracle of routines. She provided the crucial human intelligence that no blueprint could. She knew the catering company they used every year, allowing Liam to pose as a new manager and get a layout of the service areas. She knew the name of the head of my father's security detail, a man whose primary weakness was vintage scotch, a weakness we could potentially exploit. Most importantly, she knew the 6-digit code. "It's your grandfather's birthday," she said, a sad smile on her face. "Month, day, year, fight 1538. Your father spoke of him often, but he never truly understood the man's integrity. He just co-opted his memory. My role was the most dangerous. I was the operative, the one who had to walk into the lion's den. I had to attend the gala, smile and schmooze, and act the part of the dutiful if disappointed daughter. I had to endure my father's condescending charm and my mother's pitying glances, all while my heart was pounding with terror and adrenaline. My specific task was to get into the office during the 2-minute window Liam created. The days leading up to the gala were a blur of tension. We rehearsed the plan over and over. We timed every step down to the second. I memorised the path from the grand ballroom through the service hallway to the east wing. Liam would be parked in a van a 1/4 mile down the road, monitoring security feeds he'd hacked into and communicating with me through a discreet earpiece. The night of the gala arrived like a judgment day. I put on a sapphire blue gown the colour of ice. As I looked at my reflection, I saw a stranger staring back, a woman with a hard set to her jaw and a fire in her eyes. When Liam saw me, he simply said, "You look ready." At the estate, the scene was even more opulent and sickening than I remembered. The air was thick with false laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. My father was in his element, holding court by the massive fireplace, accepting praise for his generosity. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that felt like a brand. "Elara, I'm so glad you came," he said, his voice oozing with false magnanimity. "It shows there are no hard feelings. That's my girl, always graceful." The urge to scream the truth in his face was almost overwhelming, but I just smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Of course, father. It's for a good cause." The first hour was agonising. I made small talk, deflected questions about my brother's exciting new role, and kept an eye on the clock. Liam's voice was a calm, steady presence in my ear. "Stay calm, Elara, we're on schedule. I'm initiating the sequence now." At precisely 9:45 p.m, during the peak of the live auction when all eyes would be on the stage, I made my move. I slipped away from the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Okay, I'm in the service corridor," I whispered into the tiny microphone hidden in my evening bag. "And no one in sight. Good," Liam's voice came back. "Head to the east wing. The power fluctuation will happen in 90 seconds. I walked with a purpose I didn't feel, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The east wing was quiet, roped off for the event. I ducked under the velvet rope, my breath catching in my throat. I reached the heavy oak door of my father's office. "At the door," I breathed. "Ready. Power fluctuation in 10, 9, 8. I counted down with him, my hand on the doorknob. "There's 3, 2, 1. Now!" The week following the gala was the longest of my life. Liam and I worked in a feverish, sleep-deprived state, poring over the contents of the cloned hard drive. What we found was worse than we could have ever imagined. It was a digital confession, a meticulous record of my father's sociopathic greed, authored by the man himself. The drive contained everything. There were encrypted spreadsheets detailing every fraudulent transaction, every phantom invoice, every kickback, dating back nearly 2 decades. There were scanned copies of documents from the Argent Foundation, explicitly naming Arthur Vance as the sole trustee and beneficiary. He had a legacy folder, which contained a step-by-step plan to systematically liquidate Vance & Co's most valuable assets over the next 2 years, funnel the cash into his offshore accounts, and then declare bankruptcy, leaving the company, its employees, and its creditors with nothing. The most damning file was a personal journal, a series of password-protected documents where he had, in his own arrogant words, chronicled his master plan. He wrote about my grandfather with contempt, calling him a sentimental old fool who didn't have the guts to be truly rich. He wrote about my brother Julian as a useful idiot, a pliable figurehead who would do as he was told. And then he wrote about me. He described me as diligent but unimaginative, a perfect workhorse who was too blinded by love and loyalty to ever see the truth. He detailed how he had deliberately cultivated my devotion, how he had strategically given me complex operational roles to keep me out of the real game. Reading those words, seeing my life's dedication dismissed with such cold clinical cruelty, didn't break me. It forged the last of my grief into a core of pure, unadulterated steel. Liam compiled the evidence into an airtight, irrefutable presentation. He made copies, securing them in multiple locations and sending an encrypted package to a trusted former colleague at the Department of Justice with instructions to open it if he didn't hear from us within 48 hours. The day of the reckoning arrived. I called for an emergency meeting of the Vance and Cumber Board of Directors. My father, initially annoyed by the summons, agreed when I told him it was regarding a hostile takeover bid. A lie, but one that played to his ego and paranoia. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main boardroom on the top floor of Vance Tower, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he believed he owned. I walked into that room feeling a strange, profound calm. I was no longer Arthur Vance's daughter. I was a force of nature he had unwittingly created. Liam was by my side, his presence a quiet pillar of strength. My father and Julian were already there, sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table. My father looked impatient. Julian just looked confused. The other 6 board members, all long-time associates of my father, filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "All right, Ilara," my father began, his voice laced with condescension. "Let's get this over with. What is this nonsense about a takeover?" I didn't answer him. I walked to the head of the table opposite him and placed my laptop down. With a click, the large presentation screen behind me flickered to life. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I said, my voice clear and steady, resonating with an authority that made even my father sit up a little straighter. "I have not called this meeting to discuss a takeover bid. I have called it to discuss a cancer that has been eating this company from the inside out for the last 20 years. A murmur went through the room. My father's face darkened. "What is the meaning of this, Ilara? This is highly inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" "Father," I said, my eyes locking with his, "is grand larceny." I clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen, a flowchart showing the link between Vance and Copars and a shell corporation called Apex Holdings. Then another and another. I laid out the entire scheme, my voice never wavering. I showed them the phantom invoices, the wire transfers, the path the money took to the Cayman Islands. The boardroom was silent, the only sound my voice, narrating the slow, systematic murder of the company they were sworn to protect. Julian was ashen, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between the screen and my father. My father, however, was composed. A sneer played on his lips. "This is absurd," he boomed, slamming his hand on the table. A fantasy woven by a bitter, resentful child. "You have no proof of any of this. It's nothing but circumstantial digital garbage." "You're right," I said calmly. "Digital garbage can be forged. Which is why I also have this." I clicked to the next slide. It was a scanned page from his personal journal, in his own handwriting, digitally signed and dated. The entry detailed his contempt for the board, calling them his well-fed dogs. I could see the blood drain from their faces. I put up another entry, the one where he called Julian his useful idiot. Julian flinched as if he'd been struck. Then I put up the entry about me. I read his words aloud. Diligent but unimaginative, too blinded by love and loyalty to ever see the truth. I let the words hang in the air, a testament to his profound betrayal. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping, "for anyone who still doubts who is responsible." The final slide appeared. It was the trust document for the Argent Foundation, clearly naming Arthur Vance as the beneficiary, Below it was his signature, a perfect match to the one on every company document in this room. That was when his composure finally shattered. He shot to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage. Lies, all of it. You conniving little bitch! You and your pathetic professor husband cooked this up! He screamed, his voice raw and uncontrolled. He lunged towards me, his hand raised, but Liam was there in an instant, stepping between us, his body a solid, immovable shield. That's far enough, Arthur, Liam said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. At that moment, the boardroom doors opened. 2 men and a woman in dark, conservative suits entered. They moved with a quiet efficiency that commanded attention. Arthur Vance, the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. I'm Special Agent Davies with the FBI. You're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement and money laundering. My father froze, his face a grotesque tableau of shock, rage and, finally, a dawning animal terror. He looked from the agents to me, and in his eyes I saw the full, devastating realization of his defeat. He had been outmanoeuvred, outthought, and utterly destroyed by the workhorse he had so casually dismissed. The board members were in a stunned, silent uproar. Julian was weeping quietly, his face buried in his hands. The agents were professional, cuffing my father's hands behind his back. As they led him away, a fallen titan stripped of his power and prestige, he turned to look at me one last time. I had expected to see hatred or fury, but what I saw was something far more satisfying. It was the blank, uncomprehending stare of a chess master who has been checkmated by a pawn. As the doors closed behind him, the year that followed the boardroom confrontation was one of demolition and reconstruction, both for Vance & Co. and for my own soul. The arrest of Arthur Vance sent shockwaves through the city's business community. The media frenzy was relentless, painting a lurid picture of a respected philanthropist revealed to be a corporate predator. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. The company's stock plummeted. Clients panicked. Employees who had once revered my father were left feeling betrayed and terrified for their jobs. The board, shamed into action, immediately appointed me as interim CEO. It was a trial by fire. My first act was to hold an all-hands meeting. I stood before hundreds of anxious employees in the company auditorium, the very same room where my father had given so many self-congratulatory speeches. I didn't offer them platitudes or false promises. I told them the unvarnished truth. I laid out the extent of my father's crimes, the financial peril the company was in, and the long, difficult road ahead. But I also made them a promise, that I would not rest until I had saved the company my grandfather had built on a foundation of integrity, and that their loyalty would be repaid, not with betrayal, but with transparency and respect. The legal fallout was a long and ugly process. My father, faced with an avalanche of irrefutable evidence, took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. I did not attend the sentencing. His chapter in my life was over. Julian, who cooperated fully with the prosecution and testified against our father, received 2 years of probation. He left the city, humbled and broken, seeking to build a life out of the shadow of our family's disgrace. We exchange occasional tentative emails, 2 survivors of the same shipwreck. My mother remains my deepest sorrow. She is a ghost, rattling around her empty mansion, clinging to the fiction of her husband's innocence. She refuses to see me, believing I betrayed him, unable or unwilling to confront the truth that her entire life was built on a lie. I have come to accept that some people cannot be saved from the prisons they build for themselves. At Vance & Cufford, we began the painstaking work of rebuilding. I sold the corporate jet, the luxury penthouse suite in New York, and all the other trappings of my father's ego. We opened the books to forensic auditors, creating a new standard of radical transparency. I brought Liam on as a special consultant, and together we implemented checks and balances that would make it impossible for such a fraud to ever happen again. I rebranded the company, shedding the name that was now synonymous with scandal. We became Vance Legacy Partners, a name that honoured my grandfather's true legacy, not my father's corrupted one. We focused on our core strengths, on quality craftsmanship, and on rebuilding trust with our clients and our community. Slowly, miraculously, we turned the ship around. We saved the company. We saved every single job and secured the employee pension fund that my father had been planning to gut. The first time I walked onto a construction site as CEO, a grizzled foreman who had worked for the company for 40 years tipped his hard hat to me. "Good to have a real Vance back in charge," he said, his voice thick with emotion. In that simple gesture, I felt a sense of belonging and purpose that my father's empty praise had never given me. My own healing has been a quieter, more personal reconstruction. The anger and the pain have faded, leaving behind not a scar but a new kind of strength. I have learned to trust my own instincts, to own my own power. My relationship with Liam, forged in crisis, has become the bedrock of my life. We are true partners, in love and in work, our bond built on a foundation of absolute honesty. There are no more secret rooms, no more hidden truths. Sometimes, late at night, I look out from my office window, the same window my father once stared out of with a sense of arrogant ownership. I don't see a city to be conquered. I see a community to be built, a skyline filled with the tangible results of honest work. I see a future I have claimed for myself. My father's greatest crime against me was not the money he stole or the job he denied me. It was the story he tried to write for me, the one where I was a footnote, a supporting character, a good girl who knew her place. The public humiliation he engineered at his retirement dinner was meant to be the final sentence in that story. But he was a poor author. He didn't understand his own character. He thought he was breaking me, but he was merely providing the catalyst I needed to break free. He handed me a tragedy, and I rewrote it as an origin story. For anyone who has ever been made to feel small, for anyone whose voice has been silenced, whose contributions have been erased, know this: the moment of your greatest humiliation can become the moment of your greatest liberation. Your value is not determined by the people who try to diminish you. It is forged in the fire of your own resilience. It is measured by the courage it takes to pick up the pen and write your own ending.